Good morning, everyone, and welcome to AskGAOLive, the Government Accountability Office's live streaming program. My name is Sarah Kasmerick. I'm in our Office of Public Affairs. I'm joined today by Lawrance Evans, a director in GAO's Financial Markets and Community Investment team. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
Today we're going to be talking about home foreclosure rescue schemes and GAO's recent work on this. For context, you can find GAO's most recent report on this. It's GAO-14-17 right on our website. That's gao.gov. You can look for reports that came out on the 29th, or you can search for the report number. Again, that's GAO-14-17. To send in your questions today, you can send them in on email using the email address askgaolive@gao.gov. For those of you on social media, you can also send in your questions on Twitter using the hashtag AskGAOLive. So we'll be keeping an eye out for your questions and tweets throughout the chat, so please do send us in your questions and comments. So to get us started today, Lawrence, could you give us a bit of background on yourself and your work at GAO?
Excellent. So again, my name is Lawrance Evans. I started GAO in 2001 in our Applied Research and Methods group as an economist. Currently, I'm a director in our Financial Markets and Community Investment team. I work on banking issues, and we covered a lot of issues in the Financial Markets team. Some of it involves trying to stem fraud and abuse that can harm households and individuals. And this work we're talking about today fits neatly in that category.
So our topic then, home foreclosure rescue schemes. Could you give us a bit of a background on the topic and GAO's recent work on this?
That's right. So a foreclosure rescue scheme is a scheme that promises foreclosure prevention assistance, but ultimately does not deliver it, and often leaves the person worse off financially and still in the foreclosure process and could possibly lose their home. This is our second report on this issue. We first reported out in 2010, and we put out a report looking at the multi-agency government effort to combat these schemes. And then the Dodd-Frank Act, the full name of that is the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Consumer Protection Act, required us to do another study. And so to those ends, we looked at the available information on the prevalence and nature of these schemes, and we also looked at the multi-agency efforts to combat them.
So let me ask you then, what makes people vulnerable to these types of schemes?
That's a very good question to start off. So if we could pull up figure 1, that would give me the context to really explain this. So principally, the defining characteristic is being behind on your mortgage. And in that, there are several classes of individuals. As you can see in figure 1, these are individuals who are more than 60 days past due. So these folks are heading toward foreclosure, may be worried, this may be their first time experiencing this type of financial distress, and so they're very vulnerable to these scammers who want to part them from their money. There are other classes, so people who are actually in the foreclosure process are even more vulnerable. And the most vulnerable are those who are in the foreclosure process and have attempted to avail themselves of the many legitimate sources and do not qualify for a loan modification or forbearance or payment plan. So these folks are essentially looking for some means whereby they can keep their home. And unfortunately, there are only loss mitigation alternatives at that point. And so they may be extremely vulnerable because the company may promise that they can deliver on a miracle. And it's too good to be true.
Well, we have a question here from Corey on email, and it gets right to this question of somebody who might have one of these schemes affecting them. So Corey received a check for $31,000 for the summer from something called an independent foreclosure review.
Excellent.
And he wants to know if this is possibly related to a foreclosure rescue scheme.
Excellent. This is a good question, and it's good that you've asked the question. And if you ever have questions about this, you should seek out reputable advice, and you can do that, the HOPE hotline, and I hope that we can show that a little bit later on. The independent foreclosure review is a legitimate process. There were errors in foreclosure processing that triggered a review of files and attempt to remediate harmed borrowers. And so that check, and Corey, I'm willing to bet that you were in some stage of the foreclosure process during 2009 and 2010, and perhaps in bankruptcy, because that amount would make me suspect that that is what the potential error was. So if you want to be sure, please contact Russ Consulting, and they can verify that you are an in-scope borrower in the independent foreclosure review and should be receiving these sums. Now, by the way, foreclosure rescue scheme scam artists will always try to part you from your money. They will ask for money. They will never send you a check. So that's another sign that this is a legitimate check, and you should consider it as such.
Well, we have a follow-on question here from Amanda that came in over email. And Amanda would like to know, how can you tell if a company is offering legitimate relief or it's not legitimate and it falls into one of these scheme categories that we're talking about here?
Excellent question. And again, you can, if a person attempts to assert some type of relationship with the government, you can always check that by calling the HOPE hotline. If we can put that up, that would be a good time to assert. That's where you should be looking. So you can call the HOPE hotline, and we'll put it up. That's figure 4. Now, scam artists will always ask for money. Now, advance fees are illegal in most cases. They are exceptions for lawyers. So one red flag is that you are solicited for money. Another red flag are high-pressure sales schemes, right? So you didn't solicit the help, they sought you out. Another red flag is that they want to put a wedge between you and your lender, so they'll encourage you not to contact your lender. That is something that a reputable, HUD-approved housing counselor would never recommend you do. And then there are other telltale signs as well, but those are the major ones.
And you mentioned the HOPE hotline. When you put that up a minute ago, it was our figure 4 here. So people should call this number if they're concerned that they may be being contacted by somebody about a scheme.
Absolutely. I mean, that is one vehicle where you can get advice. Whether you're in distress, you're considering your alternatives to foreclosure, or while you're in foreclosure, you should contact the HOPE hotline. This is HUD-approved housing counseling, and they will give you legitimate advice as to where you should go. But if you think you're scammed, you can go here, or you can go to the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force mortgage fraud webpage, which is stopfraud.gov, stopfraud.gov.
So our next question comes in from Pauline over email, and Pauline would like to know, I recently read a report about an FBI case where an individual paid up to $15,000 for fraudulent foreclosure prevention services. How can you help us understand how a scammer can get $15,000 out of a distressed homeowner?
That's a fair question. That seems to be at odds with a distressed borrower, that they can come up with $15,000. But this allows me to, I'm not sure about these particular scams, but allows me to articulate what some of the major scams are. So in some cases, this isn't just one lump sum. This person is providing periodic payments to the scam artist. So for example, they may confuse the borrower and force them to, or convince them to hand over the deed to their home, saying that they can then perform all types of services for them, and that if they provide periodic rent payments, that they can stay in the home. So if you're providing periodic rent payments of $800, $900 over the course of the year, remember foreclosure is a process, it can last as much as a year or a year and a half in some states. So you can see how that could add up quickly to the amount of money we're talking about here today.
Mm-hmm. And our next question comes in from Jacques over Twitter. Jacques asks, what is known about the scope of foreclosure schemes, and how many bad actors are we talking about here?
So that's a good question. Let me pull up figure 2, which looks at our complaints on foreclosure rescue schemes. So this comes from the FTC database, Consumer Sentinel database, and is an aggregation of data from a number of federal agencies as well as nonprofits. And it shows, however, only complaints. So we don't know about the actual incidents of these type of schemes. We can only look at this complaint data. And there's other data I can talk about a bit later. But this complaint data has some limitations. Some folks may be embarrassed to report the fraud. Some states are not part of this network that collects this data. So therefore, we believe that these complaints actually understate the amount of folks who are witnessing these type of schemes. To be sure, there was a recent effort, and there were charges brought against over 100 scammers, and they were associated with over 17,000 people.
Wow.
Right. So, and that was just one sting. That was just one year-long sting. So we believe that it's quite prevalent. We don't have actual numbers, and we're also careful about the trends, right? Because these trends don't necessarily look at actual schemes. So we say that there's an upward trend in complaints, but there's been an increase in awareness. That's one of the things that the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force aimed to do, was to increase awareness about these scams. And so the trends may reflect some of that increased awareness as opposed to increased incidence of these crimes.
Well, you touched on something that gets to our next question here about prosecutions. We have a question from Taz that came in actually over our live stream page, and Taz would like to know, have there been any major prosecutions?
Oh, thank you, Taz. And then I'll go back to what I was talking about earlier. So there was a distressed homeowner initiatives, and this was a multi-agency enforcement broad sweep to bring folks to justice that were perpetuating these schemes. And the Distressed Homeowners Initiative netted criminal charges against 107 scam artists, potential scam artists, and of course they were associated with those 17,000 people, and they had, in their schemes, they were able to extract $95 million from those individuals. They also bought civil cases against roughly 130 people, and those were associated with a pretty large number of folks. But the Mortgage Fraud Task Force, which is under the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, the Mortgage Fraud Working Group, which is under the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, has been undertaking these broad enforcement sweeps to try to prosecute these individuals.
So, I mean, we're talking about really just a lot of money here, and also so many people that are potentially affected by this. Our question, next one comes in from Suzanne over email, and Suzanne wants to know, what else can be done to combat this type of fraud?
Thank you, Suzanne. We didn't make any particular recommendations in this report. In our previous report, we recommended that the task force, the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, I'll refer to them as the task force, the task force develop clear, long-term strategies to fight these schemes, as well as to develop performance measures so they can track their efforts in this area. And we also recommended that they develop long-term strategies specific to these types of schemes. And they implemented those recommendations. So they have a strategic scorecard where they can track their activities. And so in that area, I think there's area for additional coordination and information sharing. They have been doing that to a very large extent.
So then, we've touched on this a little bit, but let's get into this a little bit more. What are the most common types of schemes?
Excellent. That's a very good question. So we can lay some of them plain, and so you can see the nature of these schemes. So at the very heart, they're confidence schemes, and they aim to convince people that they can provide legitimate foreclosure prevention assistance. So one that's become very popular involves the bankruptcy courts. When you file for bankruptcy, Sarah, what happens is that there is an automatic temporary stay in the foreclosure process. So let's think about that for a moment. A person reaches out, solicits you, tells you that they can save your home for foreclosure. Without your knowledge, they then file for bankruptcy. So it appears to you that they've done something for you. So you're willing to give them more money. And that's why we can get to the sums that we talked about earlier, the $15,000 sum. So that's a very popular type of scam. Another one is you may get a solicitation about a mass joinder lawsuit. And that sounds like a class action lawsuit. It sounds legitimate. And they ask you to pay a particular sum to join the class action lawsuit. Well, legitimate class action lawsuits, you don't ask for advance fees, right? Lawyers only get paid after the case is won. So that's another popular one that's out there. There are other short sale schemes where I promise you that I can negotiate a short sale with your lender, right? Only your lender has the right to agree to that type of thing. And then the last one, which goes back to the independent foreclosure review, is that they'll offer to do a forensic audit. They'll tell you some outlandish tale that 95% of mortgage contracts are unenforceable, and that they can go through and do a forensic audit and find some error that would invalidate the foreclosure. And of course, they always ask for advance fees.
Well, Oh, one more type?
And there's one
Please
more
go ahead.
type that I
Yes.
really want to get at. And that we also saw an uptick in the number of schemes that involve attorneys. So if we can pull up figure 3, you can take a look at these foreclosure rescue schemes. And we've decomposed them in terms of those that don't involve lawyers and those that involve lawyers. And you can see that the majority of the schemes now involve lawyers. And that's simply because lawyers bring an air of legitimacy. And there's also some worry that there is a loophole. There is an exemption in a rule that bans upfront fees for lawyers, for attorneys. And so some people think that that is one of the reasons why we see an increase in the number of attorneys.
Well, given the gravity of the situation, do you think that, and this question comes in from Min over email, government agencies are doing enough and taking this seriously enough as an issue?
Well, we noted some significant efforts that were undertaken by the multi-agency task force and the working group. In the areas of prevention, which is one of the most effective and efficient ways to stop fraud, we found that they're doing outreach to educate consumers. They are steering homeowners to the right websites, the task force stopfraud.gov website, as I talked about earlier. And then they are undertaking efforts to track and detect and monitor these type of schemes. I talked about one of the databases that is maintained of consumer complaints. So that is an extremely important effort because that information allows enforcement agencies to understand the nature of these schemes and to share that information. They've also taken steps to modify the reports that financial institutions supply to Treasury that allow us to understand these schemes and be used in enforcement actions. And of course, we talked about these broad sweeps that are occurring.
Well, thank you. And just a quick reminder for folks, you can send in your questions to us via email using AskGAOLive@gao.gov. You can also send them in on Twitter using the hashtag AskGAOLive. And thank you for the questions you've been sending in. We've got quite a few more here, so I'm going to go to the next one.
Excellent.
From Kate over email. And this is a really interesting question. So Kate wants to know, should more resources be allocated to combating foreclosure rescue schemes?
Very good question. Very good question. It can be difficult to answer. Let me take several lines here. First, it's important to note that the complaint data that we pulled up before, which is figure 2, represented only 1% of all the complaints that were reported to the FTC. So we got to right size the type of resources that we launch at this particular scheme. We think that the agencies have done enough not to warrant additional recommendations. And some nonprofit organizations have noted that resources was an issue, but others did not indicate it.
And our next question comes in from Zach over email, and Zach would like to know, I know a lot of people are at risk of foreclosure. Is there anything that I could tell them or that people should know so that they won't become victims in one of these situations?
Right. One of the messages we would like to highlight, and it's an important financial literacy message, is that you should never divorce your lender. You should remain in contact with your lender. Your lender has a number of different options for you. If it's a temporary situation, there are forbearance, there is repayment agreements, and then if it's more temporary, there are loan modifications. You should never break off communication with your lender. That's what the scammer wants you to do. Ultimately, he wants to drive a wedge between you and your lender so he can offer you these fraudulent services. And again, as we pointed out, and we can pull up figure 4 again, please call the HOPE hotline, 1-888-995-HOPE, and you will get legitimate services. And I think that's the major thing that we can do. And avoid any of these things where you haven't solicited help. Mm-hmm. Avoid these mass mailings. Avoid that sign that you see on the freeway that says Foreclosure Hope.
Well, and it also sounds like if people are asking you to give them money or sums of money over time, that is also a red flag in this situation.
Right. And it is illegal in most cases. Again, there are exceptions for attorneys. The FTC promulgated a law in 2010 that made it illegal to solicit these type of upfront fees. It allows some exceptions for attorneys.
Well, our next question from Cynthia over email asks, are there specific populations being targeted by these types of schemes?
Right. So again, the defining characteristic is a homeowner in distress. But within those, though, there are several subpopulations that are being targeted, namely the elderly and racial and ethnic minorities.
And could you give us a little more details on that? Why would the elderly be targeted, or racial minorities?
That's right. That's a good question. We didn't particularly answer that in this particular report, but I think it goes back to different types of schemes that are perpetuated by these scam artists. Some are affinity type schemes. So I approach you with some common characteristic, So any way to get you to trust me, because again, at heart, these are confidence schemes. In the elderly, there are a number of programs that are out there for elderly. There's a reverse mortgage. If I can convince you that you're not qualified for the reverse mortgage, but I have this other program for you, you're more likely to trust me and provide me sums of money.
Mm-hmm. Our next question comes from Molly over email, and Molly would like to know, why is it so hard to stop these types of schemes?
Thank you, Molly. And let me go back to the scams involving attorneys. So routinely, as part of what lawyers do, they charge an upfront fee or a retainer. So it's very difficult to determine whether the services being offered are legitimate or not. And so that's one of the difficulties enforcement agencies have had in pursuing these type of cases. And in general, they're very complex, right? They involve the bankruptcy court. They involve the scam artist wants to find ways to delay the foreclosure process to extort extra money from the victim. So they're very difficult, and a lot of people may not report them.
Well, Jonathan asks over email, I've gotten taken advantage of by one of these schemes. Is there any way for him to get his money back?
Asset recovery is important. Unfortunately, in these cases, the scam artists, by the time that they are caught, the money is gone. So unfortunately, it's a very low likelihood that you would get your money back, unfortunately. But you should visit the Stop Fraud website, stopfraud.gov. They have a link for victims of these type of schemes, or you can call the Hope Hotline, which we just flashed up quickly.
Mm-hmm. And Brent would like to know, on average, how much money are people losing in these schemes?
There's a range. And again, remember, this is based on complaint data. Mm-hmm. So this is a biased source of information. We don't have a full population or a randomized sample. So, but based on the complaint data, people are losing, on average, $2,500 median on average, a little bit more, because there are some extreme cases where people are losing a lot of money. On average, $2,700. But if the scam involves an attorney, that's an additional $500 to $600. So well over $3,000.
Wow. And it sounds like these schemes are changing constantly. We've got a question here from Tracy over email who wants to know, how is the government adapting to these changing types of schemes?
Thank you, Tracy. Very, very good question. And again, I can go back to the work and the effort that the multi-agency task force is putting in the area of detecting these type of schemes. So these schemes change, right? And as they change, they'll be reflected in the complaint database. And so therefore, the agencies can then learn a little bit more about these scams. And again, they're getting more states to contribute to this database that the FTC maintains, and so they can learn a lot more about these schemes. Because one of the things they want to do is really monitor and detect these type of things. And then the suspicious activity reports that financial institutions provide to Treasury also gives enforcement agencies a chance to learn about the nature and scope of these schemes.
Well, Matt has a really good follow-up question here that came in over email, and he would like to know how many people have been victimized by these types of schemes. And it may be hard to know based on some of the data, it sounds like, but what did you find there?
Right. So, we say that we believe it's prevalent, right? We believe that there could potentially be an uptick in this type of activity, but again, we just don't have the data to give you the actual number or really speak about, the incidence of these type of crimes in a way that would be statistically valid, as we say at GAO. But we know it's quite common. You see that complaint database. There were over 20,000 complaints in 2011. In 2012, there was a slight downtick, but we think that's because there were some issues with collecting the data. Some agencies, some nonprofits had resource constraints. But the data that we've collected through 2013 suggests that there'll be an uptick in this type of activity again.
Well, and here's an interesting question that came in from Annie over email, and she asks, if I know somebody who's been a victim to one of these schemes, should they call the police?
That's a good question. That's a good question. You know, I would file a police report, but you know, you can visit your local FBI office. They do advocate that, and because they're well versed in handling these type of schemes, so you can find whatever your local FBI office is. And in fact, I think that's what the FBI recommends on their website. And so, you know, if it's important that you report it. It's very important that it reports in some type of complaint database, either to the HOPE hotline, to the FTC, to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Report it. Report it to the local FBI. Just report it. And therefore, we learn more about these schemes. And if we can't help you, we can help someone else.
And even if somebody is not sure if they are a victim, we had a different email from Christine that came in, and she wasn't quite sure if she was a victim of one of these schemes. Would you say, you know, go ahead and report that anyway?
I would report it. I would report it. I would talk with someone from the HOPE hotline. They can walk you through some of the red flags. Chances are, if someone charged you an advance fee for foreclosure mitigation services, it was a scam.
We've got a time for about one more question left, so I'm going to go to a question that came in from Peter over email, who wants to know, considering the increase in complaints, you know, would you say that efforts to combat them have been effective?
I see. So, given that complaints has risen, one might think that the efforts were not effective. But again, that is not necessarily true. Again, I spoke about the number of efforts that the interagency task force is conducting in prevention. And part of that prevention is awareness. So if there's a increase in awareness, people who wouldn't have ordinarily complained are now complaining. So that could be driving some of what we see, instead of the ineffectiveness of the efforts, right? Because we see prosecutions, we see broad enforcement sweeps, we see increased activity under the mortgage fraud working group. So it's probably untrue to make that link.
We have one more question that's just coming in now. This came in from Kareem over email, so we're going to try to get you a quick answer here before we go. And this person is an advisor, and they see clients that are coming in and, you know, receiving contact from different scammers. And with the addition of an attorney entering the field, you know, what can this person do as an advisor to do their due diligence for their clients when their clients are being presented with these types of offers?
Absolutely. One of the things, Kareem, I think you can do is make sure you are steering folks to the right resources, steering them to stopfraud.gov. I know I said that a number of times. That's very important. You can call the HOPE hotline yourself and put your client on and learn about these particular schemes. It's important to know that they know that anyone who charges advance fees for schemes is more than likely a scammer. There is free, legitimate help available, and I would steer those clients toward those resources. Thank you very much for that.
Well, and thank you for taking the time to join us today and for answering everyone's questions. We really appreciate that.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thanks everybody for sending in your questions and for joining us today. If you'd like to send us any feedback, you can send that to us over email. The address is askgaolive@gao.gov. For more from the Government Accountability Office, you can learn about us online at gao.gov. We're also on Twitter at USGAO. We're on Facebook as well at facebook.com/USGAO. And we're on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and we hope you tune in again next time.